Good morning, friends. I'm talking to you from my backyard. It's Bob Branch, and I'm bringing you another edition of the Daily Devo. And we are still in this kind of mode of looking back in order to move forward. That in this destabilized time that we have in the coronavirus era, that God is actually working something to go and to bring some course corrections, I believe, to the church, and to cause us to reimagine and to kind of go back and look at some of the images of how the early church kind of conducted business, not as a way that we have to be like that, but to give us some imagination in terms of what this might look like. And that the early church just moved in a whole bunch of things that were kind of the spontaneous move of the Holy Spirit. And we got through Acts 2:42, but in Acts 2:43 it says, "And everyone was filled with awe," or fear, "and many signs and wonders were done by the apostles." Now, what's interesting about that is that God is moving in power, and that God has never really stopped moving in power. I think we've just stopped, in a way, kind of expecting and inviting God to move in powerful and wondrous sorts of ways. But interestingly enough, in this early iteration of the church, there's awe. There is this sense of awe. And in the Greek, the word is phobos, which is where we get our word phobia. And when we talk about phobos, it's got a lot of different dimensions to it. It's not just a one definition word. It's very much defined by the context wherever it's used in the scriptures. And so in this particular place in the book of Acts, I think that the linguists have actually done a really good job at saying everyone is filled with awe, because these wonders and signs and things that are being done by the apostles, they're not scaring people. They're actually causing people to just go, wow. Wow, God, you're so amazing. And the things that God is doing are so profoundly amazing that we're in awe of them. So therefore, I'm broadcasting to you this morning from my backyard, because it's so full of nature. It's so full of the things that God has made, and so much of the things that God has made just make me stand in awe. I'm going to stop for just a second. I live right next to an airport. And with all of that said, then we have fear, and it's not to say that phobos can't be fear and that we shouldn't fear the Lord. That's a consistent message throughout the Bible. Even in Acts 5:11 with Ananias and Sapphira, it says a great fear fell upon the church at that point in time. And at that particular point in time, I think that he is talking about that there was a real fear. It's like, wow, gosh, when God is moving in this sort of way, when you lie, you die. Really? What? How in the world does that work? But here we're talking about this awe, and this awe is created in us by our understanding, our perspective in terms of the vastness, the grandeur, the majesty of God in comparison. So, in comparison to us, God's bigness, our smallness, God's gigantic enormity, and our tiny minuscuity. I'm just making that up. I don't know if that's really a word or not, but it's important, I think, to us to understand that awe so much of the time has to do with perspective, that we are in awe of the works of God. We're in awe of the things that God does, because it shows us where we are within the total grandeur of who God is and how God is moving for our benefit and care. And so with this, I think that if we're looking back to move forward, I think that we've got to recapture that awe. But God really has to do this in us. And so, because in the book of Acts, what's unique is they're not in awe because they chose to be. They're in awe because they actually are zeroed in on what God is actually doing, what God is actually saying. And when they do that, rather than looking at all the other things that are around them and being so sort of dwarfed by the ginormous amount of stuff that's going on in Jewish culture and in the Roman domination and all that stuff at the time, what they're looking at is, wow, for one, God has raised his son from the dead. So that's one thing that sets them into perspective right at the very beginning, that someone defied death, that the Father raised his son Jesus from the dead. And that gives us this sort of this underlying foundation of where our awe rests, that God is moving toward us. He's moving on our behalf, that the death and resurrection of Jesus are God moving toward us. They are God moving toward us to rescue us, to bring us to himself. And with all of that said, then that creates awe. And so the early church, foundation-wise, they're founded on that one rose from the dead and nobody does that. Nobody does that. Nobody rises from the dead, but Jesus did. Not only that, but then he continues to work. And so it's not just the death and resurrection of Christ and then us living in the ripple effect of that. It's the death and resurrection of Christ and God continuing to move through people, God continuing to use us as his instruments in order to, I think, in many ways, just to create awe inside of us, that we see that and it creates awe. Now, I'm not saying that you have to be like everything's just mouth agape. Oh, my goodness. But Becky and I went on Sunday afternoon. We drove to Moonlight Beach. It's our favorite beach in Encinitas, and we just sat up on top of the cliffs and we watched the sunset for a long time. And the ocean just always gives me this sense of God's grandeur, of God's vastness, of God's power, of, nobody, as much as we'd like to be able to control the ocean, not a chance. The ocean has a mind of its own, and no one is controlling that. It's so powerful, it's so big, it's so vast. This is our God. And so watching the sunset over the ocean is just staggeringly beautiful. And I sit in awe. And every time I think, wow, Lord, you are so much bigger, so much more for me, so much more, so you're moving so much. And I reflect on that and it creates awe in me. But not only that, but then on Sunday mornings when we have our services at 8 o'clock and we meet at 8 o'clock and outside, and a lot of you have been saying, I just wanted to go back to normal, but I want to tell you, this is a normal service and it's delightful. People are loving being together. We're there. We've got a really cool canopy. It's a very cool context. The youth led us in worship. It was fantastic. The same messages online. Come and meet with us. Come home. Come all the way back home. This is normal. It's what you're looking for. It's what your heart is looking for. Come and be with us this Sunday at 8 a.m. That's just a shameless promo on that. But there's something that happens over. We're over as you look at our two front doors in the front entryway of the atrium. We're the worship team and stuff are kind of tucked over in the left-hand side, and there's some succulents over there in the corner. That there's one particular hummingbird that loves visiting that like the whole time that we're there. In fact, I think he lives somewhere around there and it's his domain. And so he came and he's just buzzing, and he's one of the most incredible creatures. I think hummingbirds are so incredible that they can just hover there with their wings moving at I don't know how many hundreds of miles an hour to be able to do that. They're consuming calories like nobody's business, and so they continue to have to feed. It's just incredible. I think, and obviously the Lord will say differently probably on this whole thing, but he said, I think that the hummingbird is the coolest thing I made except for the humans, and only just by a little bit. So the hummingbird, for me, still creates awe. It's like, wow, Lord, you are so amazing at the things that you do. Awe. That we are in awe of the Lord, that we take the time to let our hearts calm down enough to notice the things that breed and create and sustain awe within us. Awe is a normal part of a healthy Christian life. Awe is coming into contact with God, knowing that his vastness, his grandeur, his majesty they dwarf us, and yet he's for us. Oh, wow. Awe. If we're going to look backward to move forward, then we're going to need to recapture awe. And so I want to ask you today to ask the Lord, Lord, would you help me to recapture a sense of awe in my life? Recapture a sense of awe. That's our word for today. Thanks so much for joining me. I love you. I'm with you in this. Talk to you tomorrow.